Um, yeah. Welcome to Plutus Foundation Live. I'm Harlan Landes, and I'm here today with Shawn Rochester. Shawn is the CEO of Good Steward LLC and the author of The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. In his book and in his presentations at Google and several universities across the United States, Shawn examines the true cost of being Black in America. He outlines what factors impact the Black community and explains how you can help close the wealth gap. So Shawn, welcome to Plutus Foundation Live. We're so happy you could be here.
Harlan, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the platform. I'm looking forward to the conversation and digging into this important topic.
Yeah, and I want to remind everyone who's watching, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, if you drop some comments in here, if you bring your questions, it would be great. We're going to try to address everything that has to do with biases, discrimination, and everything that leads to what Shawn calls the black tax. So what I hope everyone gets out of this, the book was very transformative for me, very interesting. I learned a lot from everything that you wrote in this book, Shawn. And I want people who are watching this today to come away with some transformative information. Our audience is full of people who are interested they're interested in improving their finances. They're interested in the world. They're interested in social issues that are important to them. But we also all have a lot of financial content creators, people who write about improving people's personal finances, improving people's situations with money. And I think that those conversations cannot take place without these conversations, the kind that we're going to have today. And that's kind of where, I'd love for us to kind of fill in both the information that people need to understand what the black tax is, why the cost of living in America is so much higher for Black Americans, and also how that information can help them either when they're reading financial information, financial advice, they're reading about saving money, or they're reading about getting a better job, making more money. And those who give that advice as well, what can they take from this conversation to help them do a little better in their job in spreading the information about good financial habits? So that is the purpose. I hope all of our listeners and watchers are going to be able to get something out of it that changes their perspective and gives them more perspective and more context. So with that being said, where did you come up with the idea for the black tax? What does that mean?
So the black tax is the financial cost of discrimination against Black people in America. It exists around the world. It's driven by conscious and unconscious bias that can come from individuals or institutions or corporations.
So what is some of the differences between conscious and unconscious bias, and how do you spot that?
Yeah, so conscious bias it means that it's explicit, like you know what you're doing. You're fully aware of your opinions and attitudes and behavior when it comes to Black people. Unconscious bias you are unaware of it. It's called implicit bias. So, but we still wind up acting in ways that can be discriminatory, even though we don't mean it or intend to. What's really interesting is kind of the work that researchers do to tease out how could you even kind of figure out what that is, because the person's not really aware of it. So they'll do different things to try to identify it. They'll show you like an object that has nothing to do with race. And before they show you that object, they will show you like a Black male face or a white male face. And it turns out that how you feel about that inanimate object that has nothing to do with race is influenced by the face that you see beforehand, right? You may feel more negatively about that if you see a Black male face, more positively about it if you see a white male face. Another thing that they do to be able to kind of tease out the existence of these things is, how quickly can you associate positive things with like Black individuals, and how quickly can you associate positive things with white individuals? Then the same for negative things. And it turns out that if you have, for people who have like an anti-Black bias, it takes more effort for them to make a mental association with positive things when it comes to Black people. So, Harvard has done a lot of work on that. As you know, they have this online IAT tests, implicit association tests, right, which many millions of people have taken. And it gives you levels of what they call automatic white preference, which is a wonderful way of characterizing anti-Black bias.
Mm. So it's quite possible that someone even who believes they are forward-thinking and progressive may not even be aware of some of these implicit biases.
Absolutely. And the levels are really high, right? Just to give you a couple of examples. If you go back to 2012, I think it's like Associated Press, Chicago, Michigan, a bunch of different universities did a bunch of work to figure out the bias levels, anti-Black bias levels across the American electorate. And when they looked at conscious bias, like people know what they're doing, it was about 51%. And when they looked at unconscious bias or implicit, it was about 56%. That's really high, right? You got 1 and 2 and almost 6 and 10 associated with that. When you're looking at the work that's been done by Harvard and their implicit online association tests, it's like 75% of people have automatic white preference, right? Or an anti-Black bias. And if you look at the work from Citigroup, where they kind of quote some of the data from the Harvard IAT tests, what they identify is that 85%, right, of white people who take that have a automatic white preference, right, association. So these levels are actually really high, and they're very prevalent. And the issue is, how does it show up in ways that have a discriminatory impact, right, in markets that really matter, and what's the size of that impact from an economic perspective?
Yeah. So before we talk about some of those markets, I thought a couple of things were really interesting there. So you mentioned Citigroup. I imagine that this is some research that they've done. Do you know if the bank and all the companies that fall within Citigroup have acted upon some of these survey results or study results, and has it influenced how they do business at all?
It's difficult for me to kind of speak about how they're applying it, right? What I know is that they did a bunch of work to look at the economic costs of discrimination over the last 20 years, right? And they identified that cost was on the order of $16 trillion, right? And which is a gargantuan number. And then they kind of break it down by, from businesses, from, unemployment, underemployment, a whole host, real estate, a whole host of areas, which is really important for people to understand the size of the impact, right? At the end of the day, discrimination is very bad for capital, right? Because it reduces trade between groups, and anything that reduces trade, right, reduces obviously revenue and profit. It makes the pie much smaller. And for, I've done work to talk about what the size of that is. Mm-hmm. It's great to see folks like Citigroup, do work independently to see what it is from their perspective in the present kind of context. And even McKinsey has done work to say, hey, if you eliminated the wealth gap, what impact would it have from a national income perspective, right? And they say it would create $1.5 trillion of incremental GDP for the year, so for the country. So it's the pie is actually much bigger, right, when you develop and allow people to deploy skills.
Yeah, that's massive. What did you find in your research in terms of the cost of Black tax over the course of history in the country?
I mean, if you netted it up in terms of what's the cost of resources extracted and also resources denied to Black people from 1619 to the present day, that you're over $70 trillion. It's a gargantuan number.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, so I think we will have to figure out exactly how to recuperate that money. But let's look at some of the markets that you mentioned. You did say real estate. How does implicit bias play out in real estate transactions, and what is the disadvantage that we see in the Black community there?
Yeah, so the first thing is like we talked about this really high levels of biases, right? This is important because most people, like, we're told we're in a post-racial space, so we think that things are just kind of egalitarian, and we have to understand that you got high levels of anti-Black bias that play out. So when you start talking about the real estate space or home ownership and the like, it starts off fairly innocuous, right, and irritating because you're going to be told about 20% less homes on average, right? If you're Black, and you're going to be shown about 20% less homes, right? So that's a waste of valuable time, energy, and effort, because it's going to take you longer, right, to find a dream home. So that's kind of eating up your time away from family, time away from philanthropy, time away from church, time away from anything that's really kind of valuable to you. But then as you start to get deeper in the process, you start to see more impacts, right? When you start to inquire about financing, if there's an indication that you're Black, like your name and stuff like that, you can find that you'll be treated as if your credit is 71 points lower than it is, right? And you'll be treated in a more kind of negative way. So there's a big difference, as you and your audience knows, of 71 points, right? On anybody's kind of credit score. That's a huge impact. When we looked at the last economic downturn, you had all these instances of Black families and communities paying much higher fees on closing costs, right? And on average, you're I think it's 60% more likely to pay a higher interest rate than your credit would otherwise warrant. So typically about 150 basis points more, right? So so when you start to think about that, and now if you are living in a predominantly Black community, which most large number of Black people do, your equity appreciation per dollar is actually about 18% less over time. So you're taking longer, right? You're being treated differently. You're getting a higher interest rate, right? There's higher closing costs associated with it. And then your equity appreciation over time is a lot less. So when you start talking about like a home that's like, maybe $450,000, and you start to add up those things, if those things are kind of hitting you from that perspective, you could be paying another $340,000 incremental, right, over the life of that, 30-year loan, in terms of loss in equity appreciation, incremental fees, incremental costs from higher interest rate than you should otherwise have. Then, of course, the impact of the fees, and then, of course, you and your listeners have probably heard a lot of these, media outlets talking about difference in appraisals that's been happening. If appraisers have an indication that it's a Black household, right? You had one instance where I think it was a, interracial couple down in, I'm not sure if it was Georgia, but it was 140,000 plus differential between when they thought they were appraising a Black home versus a white home. And then in the Bay Area, it was a $500,000 differential, right? Numbers that are just irrational and preposterous. But these things are happening, right?
And how did that play out? How did the appraisers? What were the clues that made the appraisers think that, well, this home is owned by a white person or a white family versus a Black family?
Yeah, so it's two things. One, if there's a Black homeowner there when they show up, clearly they know. And then two, it's the photos and the aesthetics in the house, right? What a lot of Black people will do and are told to do is to take down all that stuff so that no one knows, right? So this happens, and it's not just that it happens, but this is intergenerational wealth, right? Think about what that means if you come up with a lower appraisal, your ability to finance it, right? The bank may not be happy about that. And then your ability to start a business or finance college education, pass on wealth to future generation, like these things are wild. And it's surprising how many people, in addition to these folks that were on the news, have experienced this kind of thing. The biases are real, and financial impacts can be extraordinary.
So besides the real estate market, what can you say about buying cars? And of course, there's financing involved in that as well. But what's the situation there?
Yeah, so there was some research done a couple of years ago, kind of like the greater Chicagoland, area, where they trained a bunch of potential buyers, right? White individuals and Black individuals, and to send them out to various different auto dealers, right? And they gave them the same script, right? They have the same profile, same credit profile, or, all those things. And then they even taught them to negotiate in a similar way, right? Because some people are more sophisticated when it comes to negotiation than others, right? So, so they're going from the same playbook. And what they found was like the opening offer for, the white prospective buyer was 43% lower, right? In terms like the margin they're going to give, if they can take off a certain amount, they're giving 43% more to like to the white buyer, just before they even put in an opening salvo, right?
Yeah. So no negotiation yet. This is the initial, this is the cost of the vehicle that you're looking at.
Right. And then, post negotiations, because you put these strategies in place, they found that even, after the Black prospective buyer went through the full negotiating kind of playbook, they still wound up with a higher price than the opening salvo for the white buyer, right? So the difference was actually about $1,100. And so now that carries on into your financing. Now, the other piece is what you would have is auto dealers, had discretion to kind of mark up the interest rate, right? So there's some play that they have, and they can do that just subjectively. It's just another way to increase profits, right? Like I get it, kind of no worries. But what they found was that the markups would be anywhere from like, 110 to like 450% higher, right? For Black buyers than for white buyers. Again, you didn't ask for it, right? You don't know what's going on, but you're accruing the benefit, right? That's associated with it. So you're getting this kind of incremental, cost that's associated with it. And if you, and then if, you have the issue of the difference in insurance rates for Black versus white communities. Something that's really odd is if you look at kind of, Black, middle class type communities and white.
And this is based on zip code.
Yeah, they're looking at it in terms of like zip code and average wealth for a household and stuff like that. Okay. That the premium can be like up to almost 200% higher. Same person, no female, right, white, perfect driving record, substantially different markup, even though it's a higher income community. So these things play out in ways where you have to put more available cash to make these payments over this period of time. Now, mind you, if you're in a position where you need a car, then we're going to need to buy, 7 to 9 of them over the course of our lifetime. So when you start talking about how that adds up over time, the markups on interest rate, right? When you're talking about the higher purchase price and a higher insurance associated with it, those costs can actually be very, very substantial over a lifetime. Right, you could wind up paying like $70,000 more across that lifetime if you wound up in that situation. So that's a cash flow impact, right? That has intergenerational impact, because now you're not investing that to get a better return to be able to leave for future generations. It's being consumed by a depreciating, asset. And Black Americans buy about 5 million cars a year, so it's a big deal, right?
So these are the expenses side of the equation here. So this basically is saying that the expenses that a Black household or a Black individual needs to pay is so much greater than equivalent situation, the expenses of a white person or a white household. So in order to cover that, you'd have to look at the income side of the equation here, but conscious and unconscious bias plays a role in how Blacks earn income as well. How do things look in the labor market? What's happening there?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting work that's been done. The University of Chicago did a study back in I think 2002, 2004 to kind of examine discrimination in the labor market. So what they did was just create like a bunch of resumes and have the resumes vary in quality. So some, and by quality, they mean like prestige of the institution, length of experience, depth of experience. But what they would do is just swap out the names on a resume. Same resume. One would have a Black sounding name. The other would have like a white sounding name, Jamal versus Brandon, right? Lakeisha versus Emily, that kind of thing, and send them out. And when they sent them out, and they sent them out to thousands of businesses, right, of all kinds of different sizes, private, public sector, so on and so forth, what they found was the resumes with the white sounding name got 50% more callbacks. Same as that resume, just swap out the name, right? Now that's a big deal because, you don't get to do your pitch about why you're a great fit, how the organization is wonderful, all that kind of stuff, right? You're not even getting a chance to really do that. The other interesting thing that they saw was as you increase the quality of the resume, right? So prestige of institution, length of work history, and depth of history, the demand went up by 30% for the white candidate. Makes total sense. Stronger candidate, you want to talk to that person, right? For the black candidate, same resume, black sounding name, no statistical increase in demand. Right? Actually needed 8 years more of experience to overcome this impact, right? Sounds like it makes no sense. Why would something like that? But it's a trigger to make the association. Something has to trigger the bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And name, for example, is something that does that. And that's a really important thing. That's why you see on average when you do like compare at various levels, you'll see that Black people are overcompensating by being higher educated. If you look at top wealth for Black people versus white people, Black people are more educated, right? You have to do that to overcome a lot of these biases. And then it shows up also in kind of like your compensation relative to your white peer, right? Which shows up as a problem in many fields. I think that the average Black doctor makes $65,000 less, right, than their white peer. By the way, they're adjusting for side hustle, specialty, like all that stuff, right? They're thinking deeply about this and trying to identify racialized, impacts.
What is the impact of having to overcompensate for society's implicit biases?
Well, you clearly have the economic impact, right? Which is you're earning less and your costs are higher, which means the availability, that's a cash flow impact, and that's affecting everything, right? Business formation, business expansion, being able to reduce debt and college funding, a whole host of things. And I focus on the economic side of the house, right? But you also do have a mental exhaustion aspect that goes with it, right? They're continually dealing with these kinds of things. And then interfacing with people who don't see it and experience it themselves and doubt the extent to which it's happening, right? That can be exhausting and require tremendous amounts of mental effort to deal with that.
Yeah, and the mental impacts, play and have an effect on the financial impacts as well, because financial outcomes as well, because you have to be healthy and in a good state of mind in order to perform and earn income and make decisions at the best of your ability. So it all ties together, I think.
Yep. This mental, this physiological kind of impacts, right? That's not good for anyone. It's certainly not good for the family. It's not good for the community. It's definitely not good for the employer and, for everyone.
So my next question is, how did we get here? We've talked about the history of racism throughout the last 400 years in this country, but not so much the economic impact of it. So I'm wondering a little bit about the economic history of Blacks in America and this region, and how did we get to this point?
Yeah, so you really got to go back to the period of slavery and really look at the economic impact, right? And there's always this debate, right? People are like, well, was slavery a big deal? Was it not a big deal? It was antiquated. It was going to go away by itself. You have all these types of qualitative discussions, right? We want to leapfrog that and just go back and say, all right, what are the things that you can price and what are the things that are tough to price, right? It's very tough to price what it is to be a man and unable to protect your loved ones, right? It's very difficult to price what it is to be a woman and to be unable to control your body for the entirety of your life, right? But one of the things you can price is labor extracted from millions of people for almost a 250-year period, right? And economists have taken looks at that. In some places, a number as high as 24 trillion. Other places as high as 97 trillion, right? If you assume the truth is somewhere in the middle, then you're talking about upwards of $50 trillion. Then the other thing you also have to hone into is go to like 1860, right before emancipation, and look at the economic value placed on the people held in bondage. Because those people represent 50% of the full economic value of the South. They're the most liquid asset in the country. And they're traded on open markets as a price, right? If you're old or young, male or female, able-bodied or lame. So what's the value of those folks if you could put it in today's equivalent? So economists look at that and they put the value. It's so large, you have to measure it in terms of national income or, like national wealth. So from a wealth perspective, it's about 15.5 trillion. Why is that? Because the estimates are it's between 16 and 20% of U.S. wealth. Right? At the time I wrote the book, U.S. wealth about $85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. Take an average of that range, you're at 15.5. From an income perspective, they say the value of people held in bondage at that time was roughly 1 to 2 years of GDP. GDP, or national income, pre-COVID was about 19 trillion. 1 to 2 years of that is 19 to 38 trillion. If you take an average of that, you're at 28.5. Two independent modes of coming up with the valuation. If you average those, you're at 22 trillion. and by the way, you can keep going. You can go back to 1839. You can look at Henry Clay. He's on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and he lays out the estimate, the value of people held in bondage at that time at $1.2 billion in those days. And Thomas Piketty talks about the annual return on slave-related investments is between 6 and 8% per annum, right? If you kind of bring that forward at 5.5%, something more conservative, you're at over 24 trillion. And if you're like, who is this Henry Clay guy? What does he mean to me? Then you can go back even further, right? Into the 1810s, and you can look at what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are saying, because they're estimating the value. And they're placing it at about 1 year of GDP. In today's equivalent, again, that would be 19 trillion, or the sale of a third of all public lands in America. So even going through all those various, permutations and modes of kind of quantifying those folks, we're talking about massive gargantuan numbers, right? In today's equivalent. There's no possibility to argue that that wasn't a big deal. If that was the case, it'd be reflected in the pricing.
What was 40 acres and a mule?
Yeah, so that was, discussed by, Abraham Lincoln, and I think Sherman, General Sherman. It was Special Order 15, and it was like a possible, redistribution of land so that newly freed people could have startup capital, right? So you've got land, right? And then you've got labor augmentation that's provided by the mule. So this, of course, never happened, right? It was discussed, but it never happened, right? Certainly at scale. But the interesting thing to look at is, what if it did happen? What if you had distributed 40 acres, right, to 4 million people? That would be 160 million acres, right? That's a gigantic number, right? And if you take a look at like pricing per acre, if you look at farm acres, somewhere between like $3,020 and $6,350. Quick math puts that at $1 trillion on the high end. That's a big number, right? But it's 2% of the 50 trillion extracted. So not even 2% was like startup capital, right? For that, right? Their lot in life was, you will leave bondage, and then you will have to work, right, in the fields to be able to earn your way out of your new situation. They're starting with no wealth. In 1870, they owned 0.17% of U.S. wealth. Not exactly zero, but effectively zero.
Mm-hmm. And after emancipation, what was the situation for Black families who found themselves, in a position to be free? But what did that mean? And were they really free?
So the worst position you can be in a capitalist society is to not have any capital. If you have no capital, freedom is an illusion, right? So they left bondage with no capital. They weren't provided any. And you have a short period of reconstruction, but that comes to an end pretty quickly. And then you have a Jim Crow regime that's reimposed on these folks, right? And that's kind of one of the things that I talk about, which is to explain to people like what that is. It's not a very descriptive name. What does that mean? And it was necessary to solve, some big problems, right? The land that was taken away, all the land in the South was confiscated as a result of the war, and it was returned to them. And they need massive, cheap, abundant, readily available labor, right? Mm-hmm. And we're also in the middle of a global cotton famine, because the U.S. is providing 80% of the cotton in the whole world, right? It's 20 million people employed in cotton manufacturing, production, weaving, the whole kind of chain of it around the world. Million of those people lose their job because of the Civil War. And the world's kind of crying out, like, what are you going to do to put your newly freed people back to work? So that's shifting into this kind of Jim Crow structure, which is effectively reinstating 100% tax, right, on the labor of these people over an extended period of time.
And how did the prison system play into all of that, to the labor?
So if you look at the construct of like Jim Crow, it's underpinned by sharecropping. Sharecropping is an actual contract. So the big plantations are broken into smaller lots. Black families settle on those lots, right? And they agree to plant cash crops. And at the end of the season, when the crops come to market, they will share in a portion of the crop. Here's the problem. They don't have any economic resources, right? So they have to borrow everything from the white landowner. So the food, clothes, shelter, tools, everything that you need to bring the crop to market at rates as high as 70% per year. Compound that with the fact that when you take the crops to market, the white farmer tells you what it's worth. So this person controls your revenue and they control your income. By definition, they control your profit, right? So if you're fortunate, your profit's zero. If you're unfortunate, because they don't want you to go anyplace else, it's going to be negative. And they'll roll that over to next year. And now you're in perpetual debt servitude. Here's where the prison system comes in. If you want to take that deal, then they have laws for that. Those laws are vagrancy laws. It says if you can't prove you're a landowner, you can't prove that you've been, gainfully employed, then they can charge you with a criminal offense, put you in a state or county jail. Right? Now, if you sign that contract because you want to avoid that, and you don't deliver on that contract, and you break it for whatever reasons, you have laws for that, right? Contract laws, right? And what they will do is, again, if you break the contract, charge you with a criminal offense, put you in a state or county jail. And if you opt to stay in jail because it's a bad deal, right? It really is. Then what they can do is impose convict leasing upon you. Just lease you back out to the same white farmer that you did not want to work for, or to a private corporation. And what you have to understand is under convict leasing, mortality rate is approaching 50%. You got a 1 in 2 chance of death under that construct, right? It's incredibly lucrative, but it's lethal to be in that construct.
So we've talked a little bit about the history. Is there anything more historical we want to just mention? Anything that got us to where we are before we kind of talk about what we might be able to do today to resolve some of these issues?
Yeah, there are a ton of things. I mean, when you start to move into like the New Deal coming out of the Great Depression, which was a phenomenal investment, helping to create like the property middle class, but less than 2% of those resources went to Black people, right? Even when you have like the creation of Social Security, right? Old age insurance, right? Was they called it. To get that passed, you had to have two additions made to it. The first was that farm workers and domestics would be excluded. Guess what 70% of Black people were engaged in during that time? Second thing was local administration of it. Most effective way to discriminate is to have it applied locally, right? So that you could exclude, the remaining portion of the population. So just from that initial exclusion from Social Security, I think the estimates are that costs, Black people about $143 billion in today's dollars. That's just one aspect of it. Then, of course, it goes into the GI Bill. Less than 2% of those resources went to Black soldiers, right? It was 1 million Black soldiers, by the way, that served in, World War II. And then, of course, you got the FHA, which we're all familiar with, and redlining, basically government subsidizing, white Americans and not Black Americans, especially if you're interested in moving into federal resource community. So it goes again and again and again, all the way kind of into the present. And the problem is, it's extraordinarily difficult to accumulate resources and wealth under these circumstances, regardless of your work ethic. And people worked hella hard, right? But you're kind of dealing with the absoluteness of these issues, right?
So today, there's a big discussion about reparations, and thanks for bringing that up in the chat here. Is that a solution? Is that something that we can put through the United States to resolve this issue? Is it something that has a chance of happening? Is that something that you would suggest?
Yeah. Do I think it's necessary? Yeah, of course it's necessary, right? The gap is 14 trillion. The problem is most people believe that the position that Black people are in is because of decisions that Black people made or didn't make. It's personal responsibility, right? They're really not aware of the environmental context. They don't know anything. I mean, they know at a very high level what Jim Crow is, but they have no idea how exploitive, extractive that was, right? And oh, by the way, over the course of that period, you got 4,000 Black people who were publicly executed by their fellow citizens. It takes a high level of violence to keep that many people basically held, in bondage. When you have more information, you make better decisions, right? You have greater understanding, you have more empathy. You get rid of the Hollywood view that if it was me, if I could parachute in there somehow, I would MacGyver my way out. I mean, these things were elegantly designed, they were nefarious, and they were extremely effective. So part of what needs to happen is a general education on the topic and the matter, right? Reparations is not something that we are unfamiliar with, right? Western society is based on proprietarianism, which is property rights are locked solid, right? You have to be compensated, right, for your kind of losses. Slave owners, well, outside of the U.S., receive compensation, right? When it was like for slave property that was either emancipated or ending of the slave trade. We know that our religious belief systems, there's some type of recompense, right, for behavior that is inappropriate or untoward, right? The issue is, and there's other people who have received reparations. The issue is the highly kind of high levels of anti-Black bias, right? If you have to have an argument, over Black lives even mattering, right? Like somebody takes offense to that, right? Then, that same person doesn't have a full understanding to see why kind of reparations would be necessary. There's a lot of education that kind of needs to take place. Discussion need to be had. And by the way, nobody's doing anybody a favor here, right? You have trillions of dollars extra. There's no America if you do not have the labor and the input of Black people, right? Let's be super clear, right, about that. You're dominating 80% of the most important market, right? Cotton. It's the engine of the Industrial Revolution, right? At that point, that's coming from raw cotton, right? That are picked by 4 million people held in bondage, right? And there's a continual level of deprivation. But then the issue that people don't realize is that it's enormously stimulative, right? If you got rid of the gap, right? I think the work done by McKinsey says it'll generate $1.5 trillion a year in economic activity, which is huge and gargantuan. Where I kind of talk about it. So do I think it's necessary? Yes. Do I think there needs to be a high level of education about it? Yes. You should make an informed decision, right? We shouldn't be doing this based on what I think, what I feel, and all this kind of stuff. Let's look at the data and look at the numbers, right? And see if you can run the numbers to see how any of this is possible without that start. Where did that capital come from that went into universities and all these different industries that were created over time, right? There's a source, associated with that. So once people are better informed, some of them see like, okay, I get it. I see what needs to be done. Then you get to the big issue of how do you do it, right? And that's non-trivial. And lots of smart people are working on, kind of what's the most effective way to do it. Where I kind of caution people is, and by the way, I think people should be repaired, however, right? So whether it's cash or this or that or whatever. But one of the things that's really important for us to understand is this history, right, of Black people in America has led to a vastly underdeveloped business infrastructure, right? Again, I said there's 1.4 million businesses with employees that are missing proportionally today. Only about 2% of economic spend from Black people goes to Black enterprise. So even if you distribute $1 million per household, where is that economic activity taking place? It's going to take place largely outside of the Black community, because the auto dealerships, well, the cars, the big expenses are kind of not within our business infrastructure. So you don't have the circulatory effect. So even reparations has to have an impact of solving the business infrastructure issue. It needs to be stimulative for job creation, business development, capital availability, and affordability, within the Black community. That needs to be part of the design, right? It'll be hugely beneficial to the country. It'll be the greatest stimulus, right, that folks have seen. But we need to make sure it's not a massive outflow, right? So that's kind of something that I caution against. You got to definitely have a PhD economic framework that encapsulate it, so you have industries in there that are sustaining.
So PhD infrastructure. Let's talk about that. Is that something that people and individuals, business owners, and anyone involved with any organization can take on?
Yeah. So what PhD stands for is this economic framework, right? That I call PhD. It stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital in the Black community. Again, we got these three massive gaps. The gap in jobs, obviously, pre-COVID, it was, over, 6 million. It's even worse now, right? You got a massive gap in businesses. That was a 1.4 million. Even worse now, by the way, 40% of Black businesses had to shutter, right, last spring, because of the pandemic and the economic impact of it. And then you have the gap in wealth. These are massive things. So what PhD says is the actions, the outcome of policies, plans, programs, strategies have to have the direct stimulative effect of creating jobs, family sustaining, right, intergenerational jobs, providing, business formation and expansion and capital availability and affordability in the Black community. So individuals can do that. That's how we spend our money. You can buy a car from a Black dealer. You can use a Black realtor, your wealth manager, your accountant, your financial planner. There's all these, great talent that's there. If you buy a home and you're going to turn the house into a home, you're going to make some updates and adjustments, use a Black contractor, crafts and tradespeople, plumbers, roofers, carpenters, electricians, terrific, wonderful jobs that are never leaving, that are wonderful for families and communities. Anybody can do that, right? Black people can certainly do it, and everyone else can do it. It's very stimulative for job creations. Businesses can do it in their supply chain. Hugely important, super critical. Less than 2% of all corporate supply chain spend is with Black enterprise. That's not sustainable, right? Same thing at government supply chain spend at all levels. So there's lots that individuals can do, right? And there's lots that, corporations, institutions, and governments can do. Our alma maters can do this, right? Some of us, feel really great about our schools, with gigantic economic engines. What's the payroll look like? Your representation. How are they leveraging their balance sheet? Who's managing their retirement funds? How are they putting their available cash into institutions, right, that provide liquidity into Black communities, whether it's banks, whether it's credit unions, CDFIs, or other community-based banks that are forward-facing and provide liquidity in those communities. There's a lot that can be done. And in terms of policy creation and execution at a governmental level, there's a lot, right, that can be done.
Is there something magical about that 2% number? Because it did pop up a lot in your book.
Yeah, it's like a 2% rule, right? I kept seeing it again and again in the research. So it was just like, it seemed like in areas that are really critical for wealth accumulation, Black people tend to hover around a 2% participation rate, right? So again, I talked about that on the corporate supply chain spend. It's gargantuan, by the way, right? That's an enormous supply chain spend. I talked about that at a government level, right? I think the government spends like $600 billion a year in procurement. So this is a really big deal, right? Also with the money that, Black people are spending, only about 2% of that actually gets to Black enterprise. If you look at money for capital for business formation, whether it's friends and family, angel, early stage money, all that's less than 2%. participation in almost all high growth, high income fields, you tend to have like a 2% participation rate. It shows up, all over the place. It's actually a pretty incredible, number. So I have like a couple of pages that I devote to all the places where it really shows up. It's untenable, right? Because it's almost like it's a cap on the rate at which you can accumulate resources.
Yeah. So, we're looking into changing our bank for the Plutus Foundation, and it hasn't been easy. I'll just put it that way, to find a bank with which to move our deposits. And I believe that's probably due, and you can fill in some of the gaps here, due to just the lack of deposits and the lack of support that these banks have. It's less convenient. It's there aren't as many locations to open a business account. You have to go in person and deal with you can't just do this online like you might be able to do other things. So what are some ways that organizations and people can work with Black banks, and then what will be the effect of that when deposits are moved there?
Yeah, so it's Black banks, credit unions, right? There's CDFIs, there are a number of institutions. With Black banks, I think there's about 18 of them, right? So incredibly small number. I think about $4 out of every $10,000 in the U.S. banking system is in a Black bank. So they're starved for deposits. They don't have nearly as much as they should otherwise have. The power of putting money in a Black bank is that it allows them to be able to lend more. 70% of the revenues driven by banks in general are from interest rates, right, associated with lending. So their capacity to lend is both a function of how many deposits they have, and then the deposits have to be complemented by what they call tier 1, tier 2 investment, which is just an equity investment, in the bank. So a couple things. One, people who have larger resource base and higher wealth profiles. Some people like open up $1,500 and put in the account. For some people, that's all they can do, and that's amazing. What you have to remember, though, is those small accounts are actually more expensive than the larger ones, right? So you can overwhelm these banks with really, really smaller, more expensive, deposits. But then you have people who are better resourced, who actually have significant amounts of money, right? Just think about rainy day funds, that you just have the money there, incredibly stable. We don't use it, like money we put in our rainy day stuff. We put in, we don't take anything out. It's very, very stable. You want to put, funds like that in these kind of Black banks. Do they need that, right? Non-volatile, larger accounts that gives them more liquidity. And we want to complement that with increased equity capital infusion, so that they have, have the resources to upgrade their infrastructure, IT infrastructure, service delivery, folks who are working there, so on and so forth, to be able to meet the needs, right, of these folks. I think there's about $4.7 billion across the 18, or so Black banks. Black people alone have like almost $130 billion in checking, savings, and CDs, right? If you shifted, that into Black banks, those folks would have to hire like 20,000 people, right, just to be able to handle that amount of resource. And then you have the indirect and tertiary effects of all the downstream economic activity. So it would be very, very stimulative, for job, creation. But that has to be complemented again by large capital infusions, so they can upgrade, right, and upscale.
Do these large capital infusions, can they happen without some kind of incentive or movements to make things happen? Has any of that had any success in the past, or what would it take to get that to come to fruition?
Yeah, it could definitely happen. It's like buying shares of a stock, right? That's an equity capital infusion if it's a initial offering, right? So you've got some announcements of larger banks that are doing that, right? They're taking equity positions in some of these kind of smaller Black banks, which is great. They'll have more resources. Part of the challenge that I see is people take actions, but the actions are not at scale. These are really big problems, right? And so what people are doing is $1,000 solutions to $1 million problems, $1 million solutions to $1 billion problems. You're off by 3 orders of magnitude. The scale at which these things needs to be done is on kind of another level. And just to double back about something you mentioned before, there are some of the larger Black banks that have online banking capability, right?
Mm.
Where you could do it from kind of anywhere. One United Bank is one of the ones that can do that. And I think Carver Federal out of Harlem, right, can do that also. I believe they're Black run, right, and but not Black owned at this point. But and there are others, so you can do online banking with some of them.
Okay, great. And we'll pass along some of those resources to everyone. We did have a question going back to popular topic of reparations. Ash on YouTube wrote in, this person is not hopeful that as a group we will be given reparations, and would like to know if the Black community should just move on from this perhaps pie in the sky idea. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, and work collectively towards generational wealth, cooperative economics, and other ways for the communities to work together.
Yeah. So the first thing is people are already doing that, right? The issue is doing it at scale. You're doing it in parallel. Like nobody's stopping and waiting for reparations, right? You absolutely need to have much more of a cooperative, structure, and not just amongst Black people, by the way, with other people who have capital, right? To the end of being stimulative for job creation and business development, capital availability and affordability in the Black community. But many people can interact with that. Capital is most potent in its concentrated form, and we do not do a good job of concentrating it, right? Kind of working cooperatively. I wouldn't move on from anything. Everything is impossible until it happens. Mm-hmm. Right. So I wouldn't do that. You make the case. Anything to do with the wealth gap and economic transformation is a multi-decade plan. The problem is too many people are kind of coming out with point solutions that they want everything to work tomorrow. It took 400 years to get here. Right. And this place that we call, United States of America took even longer, 576 years or so in general, in the West. And a compendium of things had to happen to get to this point. A compendium of things are going to have to happen to get out of it, right? You got to put together a 50-year plan that you set up and that your children and their children continue to execute over time. We can't have one-dimensional point solutions for multivariate problems. You got to attack it in many different ways. Reparations, a year ago, it was not, you couldn't even talk about that issue, right? On any level, right? It was like a third rail and all that. And now you for the work of a lot of folks and important groups, now you have more consideration around it. There's a general education process that needs to happen. People need to be informed, and then they can make an informed decision. But right now it's about biases are playing too important of a role, what people think, what they feel, all that kind of stuff. So my advice is don't move on from anything. Just don't wait. At the same time, you can apply a PhD, right? We can, when possible and where possible, we can do business with high quality, Black providers, and we can approach low-income communities with a partnership between the private sector, with philanthropies, and with the public sector to address all these issues and challenges right now. There's stuff that we can work on right now as that work continues to go on to make reparations eventually a reality.
Thing here. All right, I'm back in. So is this the same as diversity issues, or is this something that the Black community needs specific answers for that pertain to Black specifically?
Yeah. So, words like diversity and inclusion are typically euphemisms for not white male, right? And if you ask who is that, it's about 90% of people on planet Earth. It's incredibly broad in general, right? So if you want to have impact, transformative impact on the Black community, you're going to have policies and programs that are specific to it, right? If you don't do that, you'll get a very dilutive impact, So I can give you like an example. If you think about supply chain spend, like the companies that do business with other companies, right, that have some scale, you say, all right, want to do more business with women entrepreneurs. I think that's terrific. I think it's wonderful. Double, triple, quadruple down on that, right? If you look at businesses that are women owned that have, at least one employee, and you say how much revenue they generate, it's about 1.2 trillion. Phenomenal. If you say how much of that is from Black women within that group, it's less than 2%. So for every $100 you put in, it's not until the $99 until you're touching like a Black female entrepreneur, right? So you got to be specific. If you say the same thing about our Latino brothers and sisters, for those businesses that are large enough to have employees, they generate about $380 billion a year in revenue. But if you ask how much of that is coming from Black people within that group, it's like 2%. Again, you have the same dynamic. Out of every $100, not until the $99 that a Black person within that group is seeing it. And if you say, let's do more business with our Asian brothers and sisters, which we should do, right? Double, triple, quadruple down on all of it. They're generating about $628 billion a year in revenue for the ones that are large enough to have employees. There's no Black people in there by definition. So if I add up that entire group, which is diverse, and I say how much of that is Black, it's 4%. So it's like filling a swimming pool to get a glass of water. Mm-hmm. You have to design solutions for the specific problem. We know that in every facet of life, right? But we seem to lose sight of that when it comes to Black people in particular. And part of the reason is because, it's like people feel offended if you say something Black. It's like, whoa, you're bringing race into this thing. Let's not do that. Or people feel like, well, what about me? Mm-hmm. When you have this conversation. However, when the program is about them, there is no impetus or requirement for them to say what they're doing to elevate Black people, right? So it's like a one-way dynamic. And that's why the information is so important, right? So people can understand, oh, I see why this would have to be specific, right? I see the size of the problem. I see the uniqueness of this experience and how it was longitudinal. And oh, by the way, that was not our experience. Our experience is real and it is valid, right? And it should be addressed, but it is not the same. Like all of that is important when it comes to designing policies, plans, and programs that have impact. If you don't, you can wind up with a very successful, diverse, inclusive program that has marginal to no impact on elevating Black constituents. And that's what I don't want to see. And that's what we see far too often.
So one final question from our audience before we wrap this up, and this is from Barbara over on YouTube. What are some of the other ways that non-Black or specifically white people can do or things they can work on to correct some of the issues of the past?
Yeah, again, it's all within this kind of PhD framework, right? So it's how do you spend and allocate your resources, number one, because by the way, some people are business owners, right? Mm-hmm. They control their supply chain. They control who's on their payroll. You know what I mean? That $1.2 trillion I talked about, those are women-owned businesses. They can do whatever they want, right? They can have more, Black women and others, within their supply chain. They can use their balance sheets in the ways that I kind of, talked about, and the like. That's really powerful. What you can do personally. And a lot of people sit on boards of universities and of philanthropies and all kinds of different kind of corporations. Like you can have an economically powerful and stimulative impact, right? We should do that and not kind of double down on the kind of symbolic qualitative stuff. Mm-hmm. The other thing is policy is really important, right? In the public sector. When you talk to your representatives and they're talking about what they're doing, are they working on policies, programs, and strategies that are going to be stimulative for creating business development and formation, as well as job creation and capital availability and affordability in Black communities, right? You have a say in it. You use that say. Make sure that your representative knows or representatives know that it matters to you. Make sure the corporations that you do business with know that it matters to you, right? If they think that Black auto dealerships matter to you. And by the way, there was 16,000 of them pre-COVID, and only like 264 or 269 were Black owned. I mean, think about how small of a number that is, right? If they knew that it mattered to you, that you had better representation, they would do it because they want to continue to maintain the commerce. So this is an enormous influence, right? That non-Black people, white people, Asian, all kinds of folks, Latino can have through their own efforts and through their influence.
So what I hope everyone has gotten out of this discussion today is some really important context in terms of the financial situation and how there are differences between the Black community in the United States and white communities. And especially when we're looking at financial advice that we read all the time when it comes to getting our finances in shape or achieving financial independence. You know, a lot of the advice boils down to work hard, save lots of money, earn a lot of money, and some of the way that plays out isn't the same for everyone. So this context will certainly be helpful when you see that advice and interpret it, or if you give that advice, maybe you have a little more perspective now. So Shawn, your website is blacktaxed.com, and you can people can pick up your book there, The Black Tax. You have another book as well, CPR for the Soul. Do you want to mention something about that?
Yeah, so CPR for the Soul is how to give yourself a 20% raise, eliminate your debt, and leave an inheritance for your children's children, right? So it's all about personal financial management. SOUL is an acronym for stewardship, ownership, and legacy, right? Stewardship is how do you manage your limited resources to maximize cash flow? Ownership is how do you put yourself in position over time where you're the only one who has claims on your assets, which is to eliminate debt over time and try to stay out of it. And then how do you maximize opportunities for resources at retirement, which is taking full advantage of really all tax deferred vehicles that are put in place, right, for us to optimize. So the idea is the Black tax at the end of the day is meant to be very stimulative for job creation, right, within the Black community. Jobs obviously coming from businesses. You need business formation and increase. Businesses need access to capital to fund and do all those things. We can put more income in people's hands. That's great for earned income. But especially if you're not going to receive inheritances because of this history, we need to be able to convert earned income into retained income. And that's all about how you handle, manage, and grow your resources, right? So the book is meant to complement that, because we don't want to create a bunch of folks who are fundamentally economic pass-throughs, right? There's tons of people that make, good money. We all know these individuals, but they have no real wealth, right? So this is to help people focus on the basics and the fundamentals to dramatically improve their situation.
Fantastic. And so where can our audience find you on social media if they'd like to follow you or get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm trying to work on my social media game. I'm not super awesome at that, so full disclosure. So I'm available on LinkedIn as Shawn Rochester, on Facebook as Shawn Rochester, Twitter is Black Taxed, and on Instagram is Shawn Rochester and Black Taxed, as well. So those are different ways to get a hold of me. For my audiobook lovers, if you're running around, you don't have time to kind of pick up a book, you love to listen to stuff, it's also, both of them are actually available on Audible. If you love to look at your stuff through Kindle, the books are also available on Amazon Kindle as well. So for all my folks that have been asking me about that, it's done, and now you have full access.
Great. Okay, and for us, follow us on Facebook, the Plutus Foundation. Join our Plutus community on Facebook to talk about financial media and financial advice and how that interacts with everything. And we've got YouTube as well, so make sure you're subscribed to us there. And of course, our podcast at plutusawards.com/podcast. And we'll be doing more of these discussions. We are going to tackle a topic in a couple of weeks. Look for us Thursdays in March, and we'll have more excellent guests, just like the wonderful Shawn Rochester, who joined us here today. And Shawn, thank you so much again. Our audience, I'm seeing the comments coming in already, and everyone is incredibly appreciative of you spending your time with us and the information that you are sharing, and certainly the context you're able to give.
Harlan, I want to thank you for having this conversation. I want to thank the Plutus Foundation for making this happen, and your audience, right, for tuning in and staying tuned and engaged in this conversation. I'm super excited about what we can do together.
All right. And those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll be back soon.